right, well, let's get started because you all are on time. So let's make this happen. Welcome. Thanks for being here. My name is Caitlin Saposi-Belknap. I am on the national leadership team of Move to Amend, and I want to introduce David Cobb and George Friday, who are the other folks who are here from the national leadership team. Will be your facilitators this weekend. And this evening we're going to do a little bit of an introduction and kind of grounding. And then tomorrow we will go through a series of exercises and workshops. And before we close tonight, I'll just talk a little bit about tomorrow. But actually, is there anything logistically I should say? Oh yes, bathrooms are, thank you, this way. And then to the right, there's a sign once you get in. And if you didn't notice, and it would be helpful to not take the stairs back and forth, there is an elevator, which you're welcome to use to avoid the stairs. Is there anything I'm missing, team? Thank you very much to, I'm going to forget. Mecca, thank you, and Joy for helping us set up and register folks and everything earlier. And because it's a small enough crowd, let's just really quickly go through and say our names and where we live. Is that okay? Yeah, because that way, you know, people can see who lives near them, etc. So let's start right over here. And if you would just stand real quick and say your name and where you live, and if you're with a Move to Amend affiliate.
Sarah Gainey, Charleston, South Carolina.
Great.
Ken Baker, Florence, South Carolina.
Rita Ray, Charleston, West Virginia. Mary Allen Todd, Charlotte, North Carolina. Monica DeAngelis, Coates, North Carolina.
Govind Nair, I'm from Fairfax, Northern Virginia, in the Washington, D.C. area.
Nice.
Dave Curtis, I'm from Columbus, Ohio. John Cannon, I'm from Black Mountain, North Carolina.
All right. And I'm Scotty Cannon, and I am too.
My name is Claudia Simpson. I'm from Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
Thanks.
Teddy Jordan, Asheville, North Carolina.
Vicki Rowan, Charlotte, North Carolina.
Great. Let's go back that way.
Matt Duffy from Wilmington.
Emma Bogdan, also from Wilmington, but I lived in Charlotte and I grew up in this church actually.
Nice. Welcome back.
MJ Timmerman, Charlottesville, Virginia.
I'm Tom Mecca, I'm from Gastonia, North Carolina.
Joy Allen, Central Kentucky.
Great.
My name is Bart Paul. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia.
My name is Tom Hyde. I'm from Carver, North Carolina.
My name is Barbara Colson, and I'm from Madison County, just outside of Asheville.
And I'm Tom Colson, also from City.
David Garthwaite. I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina.
Sean McDowell, I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina.
Nice.
I'm Anna Burr from Charlotte, North Carolina.
Aaron Freeman from Charlotte, North Carolina.
All right. We miss anybody? All right. And I should have said, I live in Northern California. Oftentimes folks assume I'm local, so I know nothing about where things are or anything. So we'll depend on the Charlotte folks to help us. And David, where do you live?
I live on the road, but whenever I am at home, it's in Northern California in Eureka.
And I live in Gastonia, North Carolina, along with Mr. Mecca, not along with Mr. Mecca.
That's how rumors get started.
All right, so I'm going to turn the mic over to David to get started.
Well, thank you very much. I got to tell you, I travel the country on behalf of Move to Amend, and we do these convergences all across the country. And I just want to say it's a pleasure to be at a Move to Amend gathering where people don't talk funny. You know, I feel right to home here. I also want to actually lift up the fact that we are being recorded by Avram of the Canary Coalition. I want to thank Avram because he has decided not to hate the media but to become the media. So if you're watching this right now, just know that it's because of a citizen journalist has decided to record this, to edit it, and put it up for your viewing pleasure. So please do join us at movetoamend.org and also check out the Canary Coalition and learn how to do media like this for yourself, because it's going to take all of us to build the world that we need. So thank you, Avram. Thank you, the Canary Coalition. Right? Yeah, round of applause. So before we get, to get started, I actually wanted to just do a read around. And what I'll do is to get to the move to amend principles, sort of what it is that we at the National Leadership Team and what it is that Move to Amend as a coalition is all about. And for somebody just at this table, could I get somebody just to read that? The first one that's in blue?
Artificial entities
do not have constitutional rights.
Artificial entities do not have constitutional rights. Who would like to tell me in one sentence, maybe two, three at the absolute most, what that means? Anybody?
Our rights of our citizens, we the people of the United States, not corporations.
Not any artificial entity, not just corporations, but unions as unions do not have inherent inalienable constitutional rights. Non-profit entities do not have inherent inalienable constitutional rights. Human beings have constitutional rights. Well done. The second one?
Money is not speech.
Money is not speech. Who would like to tell me what that means?
We all have a right to speak under the First Amendment, and the courts have interpreted giving to politicians as being speech. And we're saying it's not.
Right, and thank you for that. And a way that I actually talk about it is that the courts have illegitimately equated the idea that spending money is political speech. See, it's just not true. They're wrong. And that's an important thing for us to actually advocate, because we've been taught to genuflect to the court as if the court tells us what our Constitution is. And for the women in the crowd, perhaps you'd be well served to remember that the court once said that you weren't persons with any constitutional rights in an infamous case called Minor versus Happersett. And I want to bring your attention to the corporate personhood timeline at the back. If you have not seen this document, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom put it together, which actually goes through a remarkable exercise to show you the number of times that corporations have claimed constitutional rights and how it's always a result of a court decision, and that anytime human beings actually gain constitutional rights, it's actually a function. On rare occasions has the court ever actually stepped in, but every time it's been because there has been a broad and deep social movement that actually drove that idea. That brings us to the next concept, or the next Move to Amend principle. Anybody? Grassroots organizing versus activism. Anybody want to take a stab at what that means? Yes, Joy.
Activism is what people do when they take a sign and march down the street, when they go door to door, perhaps, but mostly when they protest or they sign a petition online. That's activism. Grassroots organizing is when you build relationships with people around an issue.
My goodness, Joy, you want to come up here and finish up the... Well, that's exactly right. Well said, right? And this is the thing for us at Move to Amend, we really are committed to the idea that we're in it to win it. And we know that that means that it's going to take time, it's going to take building relationships and so forth.
I just want to add in, Joy's explanation was beautiful. One thing I would add is it's about power. People coming together to build relationships, to take power, and to exercise power. Whereas activism, not necessarily exercising the power, maybe just protesting, like Joy said, and so we're trying to draw that distinction.
Next. Somebody tell me what that's about. Movement building. Here's how I would say it. The recognition that we have to recognize that making tangible improvements in people's lives is what motivates most folks, and that there are systems and structures in place that are actually perpetuating racist, sexist, class oppressive conduct, and that most activism, in fact, most even organizations, have been built around such individual things. Sometimes they're called issue silos or organizational silos. And what we at Move to Men want to do is actually to help us to think outside of our silos. Not that we're going to stop working on air quality issues or water quality issues or dismantling the prison industrial complex or any of the other things that we might work on, but to recognize that really we need a broad and deep social movement that is actually able to change the systems and not just some of the individual policies. And that brings us to the next one. Systemic and transformational change. Anybody want to take a stab at it in 1 or 2 sentences?
So it's more than just writing a petition or an op-ed piece. It's amending the Constitution, founding a new political party, something that remains as a dynamic in the system.
I love it. Mr. Mecca.
The transformational part kind of implies fundamental changes in values and beliefs. Without those, you really can't have transformation.
I'm just going to add the systemic aspect of it is like systems. So if you're under whatever issue you're interested in, it's always going to be affected by whatever system is running everything. So the systemic aspect of it, that's what I.
That's perfect. And I really appreciate all 3 of our gentlemen who spoke to this. I really appreciated how you were talking about making wins, right? Like that are lasting, that remain. Mr. Mecca actually talked about it has to actually get to the point of values, right? It has to get to the point of where we live, work, and play, how we think about ourselves. One of the things that I think that this system that we're currently living in that intentionally depoliticizes us, and there is a they, by the way, the 1%, right? They are constantly trying to force us to lower our expectations, to lower our aspirations. I think that it's our job, actually, to imagine, can we just be for what we're for? Right? Can we actually have the audacity to believe, you know what? I'll just say it this way. I want to live in a peaceful, just, compassionate, democratic, ecologically sustainable world. Right? And I don't think that is an unreasonable thing. In fact, I'll go you one better. I think it's my birthright. I think that as a human being born, that what nature and the goddess or God or however your cosmology operates, I think that's actually what we are entitled to. And I'll go even further. I think that love and compassion ought to be core values that reflect and should be actually reflected in our social, political, and economic institutions. And how come love is not something that we actually talk about in politics in this country anymore? Because you know what? There was a time when actually that was an acceptable political thing to talk about. And that's actually been suppressed. So when we talk about systemic and transformational change, that's actually what we're getting at here. The next one, an anti-oppression framework. Anybody want to take a stab at that one? Is that language that anybody's familiar with?
Things I think about is that it's oppressive when you say equal treatment under the law, that corporations and individuals are equal.
Mm-hmm.
That's oppressive. It's also oppressive when you have something like an antitrust act. It's used to outlaw unions rather than control corporations. That's I think subtle oppression that needs to be
right.
We need to change the dialogue.
Change the dialogue, change the story. And for me, the idea of an anti-oppression framework is a challenge to recognize that I do in fact live in a racist, sexist, and class oppressive society. And therefore, if I am not conscious, if I am not really on my game, if I'm not really trying to think about it, I will through no fault of my own, engage in racist, sexist, and class oppressive conduct. I can't help it. It doesn't make me a bad person. It makes me a person who lives in this society, right? And so I want to actually ask everybody to sort of give themselves, for the purposes of this weekend, to relax, to recognize that we're going to make mistakes together. But one of the things that we're doing in these convergences is actually to take ourselves seriously. I mean, I want to be clear, I take myself seriously, I take my colleagues seriously, and honestly, y'all, I take you seriously. If you're here for a whole weekend, the fact that you're here, I got to say, man, look, everybody, look to your left or right. Just look at one another real quick. You're all freaks. I mean, my goodness. You're coming for a whole weekend to get hunkered down on a situation like this, and thank goodness for it. Because I'll tell you something, freaks are the ones who actually make systemic transformational change. Right? Those women who gathered together, and a couple of men, but mostly women in Seneca Falls, New York, right? They were not normal women. Right? Harriet Tubman and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass were not normal folks because they actually believed that they could make transformational change, and they committed themselves to it. So this notion of an anti-oppression framework is the recognition that, you know, we live in a society that is constantly telling us that it is normal to exploit people and the planet. In fact, the economic system known as capitalism is specifically designed to say you were supposed to exploit the natural world and human labor. That's what you're supposed to do, and that's a lie. We're not supposed to be doing that, right? We don't have to do that. And so when we talk about an anti-oppression framework, we're actually saying, let's actually create a framework that is based upon a belief, a conviction that we're all worthy of love and compassion, that there's a place for all of us, and that everybody counts, and that nobody needs to be exploited or oppressed in order for everybody to get their needs met. So that's what we mean by that. Caitlin.
Add one other thing that, like David said, because it's like the air we breathe or the water we're in if we're fish, it's all around us. And so to take the time to be intentional and learn tools and strategies and techniques to be more aware so that you can see that air, so that you can recognize, like you said, it doesn't make you a bad person per se, but it is something that we are anti-oppression, right? So we want to stop it, and that starts individually, and then it also is something that is important for as we're building groups and organizing together, that it's part of the culture of the organizing we're doing, that we are anti-oppressive. And so, you know, to that end, that would mean we're anti-racist, we're feminists. We are intentionally trying to make sure that we're not perpetuating these oppressions in the work that we're doing inadvertently. And we're going to be conscious about it. And we're going to spend some time tomorrow kind of exploring that in much more detail, because we do think that that is very critical if we're going to win.
And again, for us, and this gives us to the last one of our principles, to shift culture. Back to Mr. Mecca's point about the deep core values, right? That we're not just, I want to be clear, I expect to be part of a campaign that successfully amends the United States Constitution. I'm not, like, I don't do this work to make myself feel good. I already feel good. I don't do this work to make myself a good person. I mean, most of y'all don't know me, but I'm just going to tell you straight up, I'm already a good person. I do this work because I expect to win. And for us, a win, yeah, right? Feels good to actually say, like, we going to win, right?
You'll feel better.
Yeah, right. And now, it does feel better to be on the winning side. I'll be clear about that. But the win for me actually goes deeper than merely amending the Constitution. Absolutely, I expect to be part of a campaign that amends the Constitution. But I want to win that actually shifts the culture that we live in. I want to win that actually starts to lift up and say, you know what? Rather than culturally applaud somebody for how much money they have, or how well they can hit a baseball, or how well they can act. I mean, these are all fine and good things, but how about a culture that says, wow, did you see how lovingly that fella cuddled that baby that was upset, and how wonderful he was able to just scoop that baby up and calm it down? Like, wow, wow, I wish I was more like him. See what I'm getting at here? I mean, these are what do we really value, right? And so I want to actually be part of shifting the culture and shifting it so that it's not just about power. I want to be clear. I do believe that we need to transform the social and political economic institutions. Even deeper, I don't want to just get my hands on the levers of the existing machine. I want to dismantle that machine, right? I actually want us to think about not just the fact that right now, social, political, and economic power is almost all a power over dynamic. That's what we're trained to think that power is by definition, and it's not. We could actually have power with one another, right? And that is, again, a different culture. It's a different way of being. And for many people, whenever they first come into this work, it seems sort of alien or foreign. But I want to tell you, it's no more alien or foreign than it was for Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth. Every movement that ever came before us that actually was serious and actually deserves to be called a movement was willing to actually challenge these sort of convictions that they, and again, there is a they, the ruling elite, are constantly telling us. So at Move to Mend, part of this whole introductory framework is to be clear that our principles and values come out of a deep conviction of genuine democracy, right? And the word democracy does get tossed around a lot. So to make sure we've got some common ground, somebody tell me from what language this word derives.
Greek.
Greek, very good. Demos means the people. Kratia means, anybody know? Rule. So literally, democracy means the people rule. Anybody believe that we have a functioning democracy in the United States? Don't be shy.
Crazy.
Right. I think it's important to recognize that the fact that nobody in this circle raised their hands is actually a telling thing about who we are here. Because I actually think that we are part of an early warning system. We are, Avram, canaries in the proverbial coal mine. Move to Mend, I think, is beginning to gather people around who have the courage to tell a truth that is uncomfortable for some Americans, and that is, notwithstanding what our elementary school teachers told us, we don't live in a democracy. This word is one that we are taught to revere, and I think the most dangerous threat to democracy in the United States of America is the mistaken belief that we practice one. And so I'm always proud, hey Pam, I'm always proud in Move to Mend circles to be part of folks who are willing to tell a truth that is uncomfortable for some, and that is that we don't have a democracy, but we could. And it's going to take a movement to actually get that. Before I pass it over to my colleagues, I just want to, Caitlin, should I do the...
You've got 15 minutes.
All right, 15 more minutes. Thank you. Good. So let me see. What I'm going to do very quickly, so many of you have actually seen this, but I think it's important for us to get a framework when we talk about the fact that we want to amend the U.S. Constitution, to have an understanding in its principle of how the Constitution operates. When you look at the Constitution and read it in its entirety as a system, as, what's your name, sir? Tom talked about, as a system, you'll see two principal actors in that system. The first one is so important, it's the first three words of that document. We the people. Those are hallowed words in this country, and they should be. See, we the people come together to create the second actor, which is government itself. We the people create government. We the people are understood to be free and sovereign. Sovereign means the authority to rule. See, the king isn't sovereign in our system. We kicked his butt out. But the government isn't supposed to be sovereign either. Government doesn't have the authority to rule over us. Government is supposed to be subordinate and accountable. Government is subordinate to whom? The people. Government is accountable to whom? The people. That's got a ring to it, right? I like how this is going. We the people are free and sovereign because we the people have rights. Government does not have rights. Government only has duties. As a lawyer, let me tell you, the difference between rights and duties is profound. If I have the right to do something, it means I can do it. And I don't need your permission, I don't need government's permission, and even more, if government, even if it's a legitimate political process and they go through their votes and what have you, if government makes an action that infringes upon my ability to exercise my rights, they're wrong, not me. And I ought to be able to go into court to argue to overturn any law that infringes upon the exercise of my rights. Government does not have rights. Government only has duties. And where do those duties come from? Well, remember, all power resides with the people. Power to the people was not just a Black Panther Party chant, right? The idea of the people having the power is actually at the core of every people's movement that has ever existed. The people have the power. And, in fact, Jefferson is famous for having said, no government is legitimate if it does not have the consent of the governed. Because the governed themselves are where the power actually lies. That brings me to this pop quiz. What's the population, more or less, of Charlotte, North Carolina? 400,000. More or less, 400,000. So I will celebrate that 400,000 folks here have all the political power, but I don't want to go to a meeting of 400,000 people where we decide where stop signs should go. Think about it. The people have the power, but we, the people in this system, delegate a certain amount of our power. Do we delegate all our power to government? Hell no, we only delegate enough power for government to perform the duties that we have told them to perform. And how does government perform those duties? They write laws in the public interest or make public policy. And there's going to be disagreement and debate on what public laws should be, but the point is that that's the process. But remember, we've already talked about this, no public law can ever legitimately violate the private rights of the people who live there. And now that I've taken the time to write this out, I want to point out that individual rights are supposed to be protected, as you mentioned at the very beginning, but we also have a public communitarian process by which we make decisions. Isn't that brilliant? Isn't this beautiful? We should try that in this country. This would totally work. And I'm not joking, this is brilliant, and I'm not joking that this is beautiful, but I'm also not joking we've never tried it. Because before I go 1 second further, waxing poetic about the brilliance of the U.S. Constitution, somebody tell me what year this document gets ratified. What year does the U.S. Constitution become the supreme law of the land?
1789.
Nicely done, 1789. 1787 was the Constitutional Convention, but 1789 was the ratification date. The reason I want that date on the board is to ask you this. In 1789, who gets to be a legal person and who has all these rights in this document? White. Male. Landowners. That's a lot of restrictions, y'all. In fact, you know what percentage of the adult human beings living here could actually claim to be legal persons in 1789? 5%. Another way to express that is 95% of the human beings living in the founding of this country that we are taught to revere were not legally persons. Another way to say it is, for all the beautiful rhetoric, and this is beautiful rhetoric, but the application, the lived reality for most human beings was that it was racist, sexist, and class oppressive. The indigenous people who already lived here were subject to intentional, deliberate genocide. That's a truth that needs to be told out loud. So too was this country built by slave labor, by enslaved African human beings. That truth needs to be told out loud. And most women couldn't even own property. Hell, women were property by any reasonable understanding of that word. There was a systemic not just sexism, but an anti-woman patriarchy that was at the heart of this. See, I'm not saying all of this to denigrate it. I'm saying the concept of who has a constitutional right, who is a person, matters. And that's why this notion that a corporation can claim to be a person with constitutional rights is not just a legal technicality. Legal personhood matters. And what particularly pisses me off as a lawyer is the recognition that the wealthy elite have used this process of corporate personhood or corporate constitutional rights to steal our sacred right to self-government. And they have turned everything that we were taught on its head. Because it takes an action of state government through the chartering process to create the corporation. Because the corporate charter can be used to hold the corporation subordinate and accountable through the chartering process. They used to only be allowed to exist for a time certain. They had to exist in the public interest. The corporate charter describes the duties of a corporation, and there was a time when no corporation could even exist if it supported the public, if it ever did anything to violate the public trust. The point is, it should be obvious, a corporation, for this to work, even if all people were people, a corporation must be politically, democratically controlled because it's an artificial entity created through the state political process. So when the U.S. Supreme Court, in an act of supreme judicial activism, says, oh no, a corporation must be treated as if it's a person with rights, it perverts the whole framework. See, corporate personhood is not just a technicality. It really is at the heart of how our government has been stolen from us. And again, they use the legal system to legalize the theft. And they tell us, well, this is just the operation of law. But I want to remind you, that's also what they once told women, what they told African Americans and other people of color. It's what they once told gays and queers. I mean, the reality is that we're constantly taught and trained to think that, well, the judges tell us what the law is. Well, bullshit. I mean, pardon my language, but my mama once said, she said, son, don't just curse willy-nilly because it'll look badly on me, like I didn't teach you any better. But she did say, there are some times where some things are so profane that it's the right word to use. And I really think that's true, because when you think about it, it is profane to think that our law can somehow be used to legitimize immoral, unethical ideas. Not on my watch. And that's the reason I'm so happy to actually be part of a movement, and you, each one of you, to actually be here with us for this weekend to dig down, not just on this, because we are going to do some political analysis and political education with one another, but we're also going to spend the time that we need to actually be learning from each other, with each other, and we're going to actually continue to develop the plan, because again, as I say, I don't want to just be right, I want to win. Right? So thanks so much for giving me this opportunity to give the big picture frame. And I am now going to turn this over to my colleague George Friday. And George, I'm going to, for Avram's sake, if we'll figure out a way for you to handle
Attach this somewhere.
This one.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, is this working, Avram? I'll just tuck it somewhere. I'm going to have a seat. I'm not going to jump around as much as David. I'm going to sit here and chat with y'all a little bit. And welcome to being part of the Move to Amend movement. And when David talked about other social movements in the past and how those built power, I just wanted to encourage y'all for just a couple of folks to tell me, when you think of past movements that have created transformational change in the structures or institution in our country, what do you think was the most powerful? Any things that come to mind as a movement in this country? Yes, ma'am.
Luther King leading the people to protest the way African Americans were treated.
Yes, ma'am. So the civil rights movement, definitely huge. And us being, ma'am?
Suffrage.
And the suffrage movement, fantastic. Both powerful movements in the last century, that have given us a sense of what it means to change the direction of the country in substantial and significant ways. So earlier David mentioned that there are different sectors that we work in, different issues that we think are really important. I mean, y'all probably have been in a conversation with someone, I know I have been, and folks have said, here's the thing we need to work on. If we just deal with X, everything else will be fine. Have you ever heard that from somebody? If we just got rid of blank, or if we just had Y, right, everything would be okay. And imagine that conversation again, and say that, yes, if we just got rid of blank, or if we just had Y, would everything indeed be okay? And for me, the answer has always been no. If we could just tomorrow end misogyny and sexism, would everything be okay? No. We'd still have a climate that's catapulting towards destruction. We'd have an economy that leaves most people in the dust and want that's just overwhelming. And we'd still have foreclosures to contend with and health costs that are historically skyrocketing. We would not have justice with a capital J. So in creating a movement that can win, because I certainly expect us to win, it requires that we step outside of just that slice of the work that feels like it's most important to us and build effective relationships across every sector so that we've transformed the culture to the extent where the only thing that's left is winning. And sometimes I think about what that looks like in terms of like people in the streets, the activism that Joy mentioned earlier, people out there protesting. So if there's an issue that only affects me, only affects people of African descent who are female and live in the South, that's a set, and all of those folks showed up. That'd be pretty good, but could we win by ourselves? Could a whole bunch of Southern-born black women who grew up in poverty win by ourselves, do y'all think, if we wanted justice? No. So let's bring in some men, and bring in some young people, and bring in people of different faiths, and different races, and different ages. What do you think? You think we're in better shape? So when it comes to us building our movement for a meaningful constitution that makes it clear that corporations are not human beings with constitutional rights and money is not free speech, how do we win? We win by getting everyone who cares about fracking out. We win by getting everyone who cares about healthcare costs and foreclosures out. We win by getting everyone who cares about the education system, the banking system, out and active. That becomes our movement. We have our power multiplies, our numbers multiplies, the breadth and depth of our influence is very real. And that's a movement. That's what movements look like. And that's what's ahead of us in terms of building a movement for a meaningful constitution that makes it really clear that corporations are not human beings and money is not free speech. And we've done this before in this country. We as human beings have done it in this planet, on this planet. And together we absolutely can do it, but it does require seriously addressing where we are, what our strengths are, what we're missing, and then dealing with what we're missing so that we have a full picture. And we have everyone at the table. So that everyone who is negatively affected by corporations gone crazy knows and speaks up and helps to contribute to the movement that we're building. And that's our work ahead of us. And as David said, it is work that's not like, oh, we're going to be finished next week. This is like social movements. I was thinking of, in some ways, the civil rights movement. And there are folks that can make an argument that the civil rights movement began, in many ways, not just in the 50s or 60s with folks like Martin Luther King or, SNCC or other groups that were doing great work. There are folks who work together around labor issues in the 30s across race that were talking about the beginning of the civil rights movement. And of course, Brown versus Board of Education was in the 50s. So in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s, there was all of the foundations were being built of that movement. And we've been building the foundations of this movement since November 2009, or wherever the heck we got together in San Marin, or wherever it was, Marin County, Marin. Same thing. So now, and that's why it's fantastic to be with y'all here this weekend, because you're part of that movement. And part of what we'll be talking about in the next couple of days are what are the skills that are required. What skills must you hone to be able to be effective in that movement and have utility? And I think this is my life's work. I feel like I walk around with a toolbox in terms of movement building. And in this toolbox are what we need: communication skills, anti-oppression skills, public speaking skills, facilitation skills, designing workshop skills. Whatever it is, it's our responsibility, if we're taking ourselves seriously, to have those skills. And one huge skill that we really need is being able to develop a sense of consciousness, both about who we are, how the culture we've grown up in, how that air we're breathing and water we're swimming in, if we're fish, as Caitlin said, have affected our ability to connect with other people and to be able to communicate effectively our own values and our plan for where we're going together and how we're going to get there. And how we're going to get there when it comes to the Move to Amend work is through building a movement that's so broad and so deep that when we say, we need to amend the Constitution now, it's like, okay, right? That's it. That's what's up. And that's the way we see it happening, is that we have done the work so successfully that we've got the people, we've got the numbers, we've got the powers, it's a done deal. And that's what our work is together. That's what we'll be talking about over the next couple of days and helping you to feel when you leave Sunday afternoon to say, I got my toolbox right here, I'm ready. And so that you feel like that when you go back home. All right, so now I can get rid of this. Caitlin, you can stick it in your lovely place.
I was going to make a joke. No, I won't make that joke. About, can I just hold this? Is this okay? Yeah, okay. All right, so let's see. So let me put it back on this for a moment. There's a couple other principles that we could put on here, and those of you who are part of Move to Amend affiliate groups have probably heard me talk about some of them. One that's really important to us is local democracy and local organizing. And the three of us are, along with 10 other folks on the national leadership team of Move to Amend, approximately, there's 11 of us, I think. But our background and our history is that we are community organizers. That's how we have come to do this work. So while we're on the national team and we are, orchestrating / coordinating this national effort, where our roots is in local communities. And that's actually where we think that organizing needs to happen, because it needs to be about building those relationships, as Joy said. It needs to be about connecting to the concrete things that are affecting people's lives, the symptoms of corporate rule that actually impact people on the day-to-day. And that's about what's happening in your communities. And what's happening in North Carolina is different than what's happening in Northern California, is different than what's happening in Florida, and it's different than what's happening in Wisconsin. There are a lot of threads to tie it all together, and increasingly, as we are seeing the need to be more and more on the defensive, those threads are stronger and stronger to show the connections, and that's our work. But nonetheless, the way we talk about it, the exact thing to say, the exact communities that we're working with are different in different places. And so that's really critical and important to us, and we want to acknowledge that and lift that up, and believe that those of you who live in the place where you live know best how to work with your community. Those of us who live somewhere else are not really in a position to say what's best for communication and coalition building in your town. And so we're a bit different than a lot of other national groups because that is our background, and we take that very seriously, and we really believe in that. We also, though, because we do have community organizing experience, those of us on the national team, you know, we've done the work on the ground too, and so we can kind of speak to that and hopefully have some expertise or experience and help to assist you if you've, for example, never done community organizing, because there are a lot of people in Move to Amend who are new to doing organizing work, or even new to activism, and we welcome you in. But it means there's some training to do and work to do. So we could have put localism or local democracy up here. And one of the other things that, because Citizens United was kind of this spark that really lit a fire under a bunch of us who maybe hadn't really been working from this angle before, or maybe, like I said, have never been active before, there is kind of this sense with a lot of folks that Citizens United was sort of the beginning of the end, right? And that everybody realized, oh, corporate personhood became a problem with Citizens United. That is when the court said that corporations have the same rights as people. And for us, it's really, really important that we understand the real history of that moment and put it in the context that it deserves, because one of the primary ways that we think that you need to be able to move forward is to understand the past. And the past definitely gets, clouded. David spoke to some of the things that we learn in, elementary school history that aren't quite right? That we don't get the full story. If you think about one of the tools of colonialism and colonial oppression, one of the first things that happens to a people is you remove their history. You don't let them speak in their own language, you don't let them tell each other their history, and so they lose that, and they become out of context, and then they gravitate to the history that is told by the dominator, the colonizers. And we in this country have that same problem going on. We don't really know our history. We don't know a lot of the movement history. Maybe we know a few names. Maybe we remember the one page in our book about Rosa Parks, how she was tired one day. None of that's true, right? Rosa Parks was a skilled organizer who was secretary of the NAACP, who had been at Highlander Center and trained, and the Montgomery bus boycott was planned and orchestrated, and her role was to kind of kick it off because she was a sympathetic character as an older woman, but she wasn't just some lady who was just tired and just was like, you know what, this Jim Crow has just gotten to me now and I'm just done, right? So all of this is like stuff we got to learn if we don't already know it, because it matters. It matters that, people actually got together and planned together in small groups and didn't know that they were going to win, and now we think of it as, it was inevitable, and everyone just sort of sided with Rosa Parks and yay. And that's just one example. So it's really important that we know our history, and Citizens United is not a new phenomenon. This idea that corporations have constitutional rights is not new. David referenced the timeline, and if you haven't seen it before, encourage you to look at it. It is a bit daunting to actually see how far back it goes, to the late 1800s, where the courts first started to recognize the idea that corporations have constitutional rights. At the same time as they said, actually, women don't, though, by the way. 14th Amendment is going to apply to corporations, but it's not going to apply to women because it wasn't meant for you. It was only meant for men who had, African-American men who had been slaves. But actually, also now it applies to corporations, right? Ludicrous. And then, and we'll talk some tomorrow about some of these other cases that helped build this doctrine, not just a phenomenon that just happened in 2010, but a whole doctrine of the way that property is treated under the law, that it can actually exercise its rights in court over the will and the needs of human beings who live in a community or a state, or in the case of Citizens United, it was the federal government that had a law restricting corporate contributions that they overturned, McCain-Feingold Feingold. And every single one of these times is laws being overturned, laws that were passed democratically by either the citizenry directly through a ballot initiative or public elected officials, right? So, and one of the other contexts in this whole thing is that actually those of us who started Move to Amend did not form in 2009 was when we got together at the meeting that George referenced, but a number of us who had been working on this issue for some of us more than a decade actually came together and said, here's an opportunity that we see coming. We have a hunch how the Supreme Court is going to rule in this one. Maybe it would be a good chance for us to start to talk about a constitutional amendment. And honestly, to tell you the whole honest truth, we expected it to be an opportunity for some media framing. A petition was part of the package. And it was an opportunity for those of us who were part of several different organizations that sometimes worked together, sometimes competed with each other to foundations or donors, because we were all working on the same issue, so there was some overlap that sometimes caused tension. And we did not expect the response that we got. We did not form a whole organization at that time. It was after we saw the outrage to Citizens United that we realized, holy crap, we actually do need to build a whole organization and respond and actually an infrastructure around this desire to actually have a constitutional amendment. So that is what we did, and it took us about a year to kind of catch up with you all. Maybe it wasn't you in particular, maybe you're newer to us, but some of you I know were there from the beginning who signed that petition and were like, I'm ready to go. And we were like, it's not that we weren't there, but we didn't have a whole organization set up. So we do more now, and one of the things that we really emphasize, and we've emphasized from the beginning to go back to the local piece, is local groups. So how many of you here are part of a local Move to Amend affiliate group? Can you raise your hand? Okay, so you can see about half the room. So those of you who are not, keep your hand up for just another minute. Those of you who are not, look around, take note of these folks. Tomorrow, because we normally have a few people who come on Saturday who aren't here Friday. So tomorrow we'll check in again about that, and we'll actually identify which affiliates are in the room. And if you maybe live in a place where there was one that you didn't even know about, we'll make sure you get connected. But we have from the beginning had the structure of local affiliate groups, which is really where, from our mind, the rubber meets the road in terms of doing the work. And so if you are not part of an affiliate yet, I hope that's one of the things that you'll think about through this weekend, is potentially starting a group in your community, and we could help connect you with other Move to Amend supporters if you don't know any who are in your community to help get that started, because we do have a list of 300,000 people who have signed the petition, so there are, I guarantee, some other people near where you live who you could work with. But that's really critical, and so hopefully some of the work that we'll do tomorrow will be helpful to you in thinking about how to form these groups in a way that is effective and isn't just about like meetings and discussions, but actually moves into doing organizing. I think that was the main thing that I just wanted to add to what all we said, is this real emphasis on, I guess the other thing I would say is that we really do see ourselves in partnership with you. And in that way, almost all of the folks on the national team are volunteers, and our affiliate coordinators are volunteers. I was joking with George when David was saying, I'm not in it for this, I'm not in it for that. I was like, he's in it for the money. But no, not really, because he actually doesn't make any money from Move to Amend. And most folks don't. And that's really one of the things that sets us apart from some of the other groups as well who are working on this issue, who did kind of form up in response to Citizens United, is that we really are kind of from the grassroots. And even though some of us are working on the national level, some of us are working on the grassroots level, that emphasis on the grassroots organizing is really, really critical to us. So we were thinking that it would make sense to give you a little bit of time to talk to each other this evening, and so that's why you're at the tables. And those of you who didn't get a table, we can move this one over for you. And there's also a couple chairs right here. There's one right there. So do you, with your table mates, just introduce yourselves. maybe take a minute to talk about, why you're here, what brought you here, and just do a quick go around so everyone gets to go. And then what struck you about anything that any of the three of us talked about here in terms of, as we're trying to describe kind of the foundational principles of Move to Amend and where we're coming from and what it is that you're signing up for by committing to work with Move to Amend. Anything that struck you, that resonated. Also, if there was anything that was, confusing, that you're not quite sure what that meant, and what is that? And if your table mates want to offer a response to that, or if you don't have a response, that's okay, because we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A also at the end. So those two things: what struck you and resonated, and also anything that you're not quite sure about, or you weren't sure what it meant, or whether that's for you. And we'll move this other table over to the back right now, and you'll have about, let's say, 20 minutes to do this. And I'll give you a time check with 5 minutes to spare. All right, so we wanted to save some time for if anyone had questions or things you wanted to share with everyone. Wanted to make some space for that. So, how do you all want to do this? Is there anybody who has a burning question that you didn't resolve at your table? No? Yes?
We are in disagreement about something that I was saying that in the corporation, you have the corporation has a pile of stock to sell. And I was under the impression that, generally speaking, 51% of the stock is owned by one person, and then the rest is owned by everybody else.
This is the background to how we got to this issue.
Sure.
We got to the issue because we were talking about the constitutional amendment that this movement eventually envisions.
Excuse me,
and
can everybody hear? Okay.
Yeah, we got into discussion of how there may be some intermediate steps, and one of those would be, for example, there's something at the Securities and Exchange Commission that, if it's ruled upon, would require publicly traded corporations to disclose, political expenditures that they engage in. Right now, as shareholders, we don't know what the corporations that we own through our 401ks or our mutual funds are spending their, we don't know their political expenditures. We don't have any right to know that. Now, if you could just throw some sunshine on that already is going to produce a huge deterrent effect, because we should be knowing if our corporations are spending money to fight climate change, are spending money to suppress voting rights, and we can go down the list. So we talked about that. We were talking about, is there some intermediate step? And so the issue about who controls corporations.
Okay, so there was kind of two questions. One was, how do corporations work? And the other one is, what about interim steps between now and the amendment? Do either one of you want to address either one of those things?
Well, I'll just say the corporate form and shares is a function, varies wildly. And when I say wildly, I mean there are many corporations where one person owns 100% of the shares, including some very large corporations. There are some where only a few family members own all of the shares. Walmart comes to mind. So this notion that 51% is not a magical number, so just to clarify that, a corporation under law exists when a group of investors come together, make an application to the Secretary of State, and it's still an application, by the way. You must make an application to the Secretary of State. Now, today, that application is rubber stamped, but there was a time where it was actually very tightly politically controlled as a process before it was granted. We can go into this. I think we've got time at some of the workshops that will go into that. But that's my short answer to your question on the 51% threshold.
And the steps?
Disclosure, do you want to talk about that? Or whatever, other steps?
No.
Do you want to say anything?
Not really.
So Move to Amend as Move to Amend is pretty clear that in terms of like the policy that we're working on, it is this amendment. It's not a nebulous amendment. There's language. It's the We the People amendment. And it says the 2 points of our principles that are the top 2 right here. Certainly disclosure would help, and there is a push by the lawyer who argued for Citizens United and others to try and make even the anemic and crappy disclosure rules that we already have unconstitutional, to say that they're a violation of the First Amendment rights of individuals and corporations, their right to privacy, to not speak about how they're spending their money. So if it didn't matter, they wouldn't be pushing for that, right? But on the other hand, even if we were able to say, oh, look, here it is, here are the people who are running our government, not us, that does not solve the problem. So our position on disclosure is we certainly wouldn't discourage anybody from working on it, and we do, there's certainly connections, and anyone who's interested in disclosure I think probably would be interested in Move to Amend and the We the People Amendment. But we also kind of want to keep our eye on the prize, and we don't even think that the amendment is like the be-all, end-all of making this country the democracy that it should be, but it's a big enough prize that we're trying to be real clear and focused in on that. So
it's here.
I'm sorry?
It's part of Section 2.
Right, it is.
Yes. Well, yes, and you're right. And if the amendment, right, the amendment actually does say that all contributions, thank you for that. Good point. So you're right, the amendment actually does have a clause that says that the contributions would be disclosed, and so it would actually make it at a constitutional level rather than a policy. Joy, did you want to add to that?
I wanted to take it in this direction, that 2 points. Number one, and you all helped me understand this some time ago. As a human being, I have a quantifiable amount of energy. And if I let it get spread out on 6 different issues, I don't get much done on any of them. I need all the energy I've got to go in just this direction. The second part of it was, I think we should say out loud that lots of these, I've come to recognize them as DC-based nonprofits, are really picking up on the money in politics piece as going to solve it. And that disturbs me that there might be enough support for that to make people think that if something in that direction passed, the problem would be solved.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be mighty hard then to organize those people to really go out and solve the problem if we wasted our energy on something that doesn't get it.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So let's put a fine point on that, because it probably will come up more than once this weekend. So there's these 2 planks, right? And our amendment addresses both of them. And there are factions, or whatever, however you want to call it. There are streams within this whole effort that kind of make the case, well, maybe let's separate them out. Maybe we could get one of them, and then we'll try for the other one. Or, well, really just the money is not speech part is the part that matters. There are some folks who are working on this issue who you may have crossed paths with or seen materials from, who talk about a constitutional amendment, but really what they're talking about is getting money out of politics, which is about the money is not speech, and it doesn't address corporate constitutional rights at all. And for us, the 2 have to go together. You can't leave out the money is not speech, because then you don't do anything about addressing individuals who are also buying elections. It's not just corporations, it's also wealthy individuals, right? But you also cannot leave out the corporations are not people, because when corporations have constitutional rights, it gives them the power to overturn our laws, as we talked about earlier, as the timeline shows. And so we haven't really moved forward to making sure that we don't have corporate rule and that we have people ruling. And so for us, the 2 go together, and you will never see Move to Amend separate them out or say, okay, we'll just do this. We have actually made a pledge to ourselves and to you and to everyone who's involved with this that our role and our job is to make sure we have this moment where 80% of the American people in polling consistently show that they don't think corporations should have the same rights as people. So why would we say, well, let's settle for less when we actually have the people with us? It's a matter of being organized. So we're going to use this opportunity to go for the whole enchilada and not just a halfway, tostada, and make it happen. So Was there a hand somewhere in?
Does move to the in the information you have put together so far, do you have a piece someplace that explains the interrelationship between those in terms of what you do?
Yes, yeah. There are a couple, if you go on the website into the recommended reading section, those are kind of the key articles that we have written that we think explains where we're coming from. And there's one that's called Why Abolish All Corporate Constitutional Rights? Because there are also some who would say, okay, how about if we just address the First Amendment rights of corporations not to spend money? So that article explicitly speaks to what you're asking about. Any other, yeah?
Yeah, we're getting engagement from Tea Party rank and file.
Anybody want to speak to that? Tea Party?
Sure. Because the overstep that corporations have made is so obscene and profane, it can attract a range of people from different political perspectives. And we really welcome that. And we welcome the participation of principled conservatives and possibly people who are part of the Tea Party. We don't necessarily recommend that you beat a path to their door around this issue, because in terms of movement building, chances are you're going to be better aligned and build more consistent power with folks that you share a broad set of values with, and move forward working, over time with them, because it is a long haul trek. And during that trek, you are going to bring in people, principled conservatives, all the time, because we get plenty of those folks in our audiences as well. And welcome if you're one of those folks. Other questions? Yes, Tom?
I just want to add a mild caveat, which is
Put the chickens away, sorry.
My relatives, most of them are from the eastern part of the state. They're very conservative, and some of them are associated with people, Tea Party types. And going back to the 80% thing, I think there are ways to tell stories, as David is kind of saying, that can get them there.
That's right.
I'm not saying that it should be a focus, but I wouldn't dismiss the opportunity to build a few bridges, because they're more than 80%, 90 to 95% of the people that aren't making $1 billion a year understand that the system is rigged. It's rigged. And I think that provides common ground to build everywhere.
Without a doubt.
Build faster somewhere else, but I wouldn't just totally go.
No.
That's not worth pursuing, because I think it is.
A movement it's inclusive. An effective movement is inclusive. So you don't want to, as a matter of course, discount anyone or close the doors to anyone's participation, but you also want to, as you're moving through this, build around other values and principles. And certainly people who are more conservative care about we the people having a true democracy, corporations not ruling us, and having a constitution that's effective.
I think one of the points that I've used a couple of times is, and kind of fledged a little bit about Occupy, is that the Tea Party folks, when you tell them the story that David told about the people that were dumping the tea off the ships were dumping the East India Trading Company, and go into that story about how all of Parliament owned stock, they start to move away from everything being government's fault. And if you'll throw in that Occupy was really concerned about the corporations, but and that now that kind of the government and the corporations are one and the same, you feed upon that dissatisfaction that everybody has. Start telling their stories, and then maybe they're off to the races with this group or that group.
Yeah, there you go.
Tom, I appreciate how you just framed it, and the ability to actually walk with somebody without having to completely be down with them. Because I've actually given workshops and presentations to Occupy groups and to Tea Party groups. and I get laughter and I get applause in both places. I want to be clear, the laughter and applause comes at totally different places. But you can tell a story, right? And I'm going to use a Venn diagram because I think it's important to recognize. We've been talking about the Tea Party. And what is the Tea Party angry about? Well, as we say where I'm from in Texas, government. Big government. Right? And in fact, let's just acknowledge this. The Tea Party, for a small shining moment, was actually a genuine populist uprising that happened because of outrage over the bailout of Wall Street America and the big banks and the big major corporations. And I'm just going to say this. I think that that's supposed to be the left and progressives, that's supposed to be our territory, right? Wall Street greed and so forth. Let's just own the fact that too many progressives and liberals were unwilling to go out and protest because there was a Democratic president, and there was the understandable euphoria of the first African American president that prevented people from being willing to protest. And as a result, I'm here to tell you that I believe that a void was filled, that we actually could have actually owned that issue. And then the second thing that I want to say is within 2 months, within 2 months, the Koch brothers spent millions of dollars in slick, glossy advertisement materials and buses and whatnot, and took it over. But the Tea Party movement at its core was angry about big government and especially the bailout. The other movement that you mentioned, Tom, is the Occupy movement. And what is Occupy angry about? Well, it's in its name. Wall Street. And of course, you've probably seen that I've drawn this as a Venn diagram. Because in every Venn diagram, there is the sweet spot of overlap. And in this sweet spot of overlap, there is this recognition that Wall Street America, by using money, has taken over big government. And big government is now making laws that only benefit Wall Street America. Here's my point. I think if you take out the small but very loud part of the Tea Party movement that is actually fundamentally racist, fundamentally xenophobic, right? I genuinely believe that those people are there. Don't pretend like they're not, right? You can't pretend like they're not because they're so loud, but I think they're a minority. If you take out that minority, and then in the Occupy movement, if you take out the small but loud, burn it down crowd that Occupy represents, because that's also part of it, right? The point is, if you take out those loud, but I believe more small, you will actually find a level at which you can find some common ground. Now, having said that, like George, I don't want to spend a lot of my time going to Tea Party groups trying to convince the leaders because they have a certain ideology. But I am more than happy to talk to people who think of themselves as part of this Tea Party movement and find the common ground where we can find it. And that, I think, Tom and Dan, what I heard y'all talking about, and that we are eager to do.
Oh yeah. I think this actually raises the issue of how you get different groups, with different interests, around this issue of citizens united and corporate speech. Because I've personally been in many groups and discussions where people will say, no, we need to focus on voting rights, climate change, reproductive rights, and all good things everyone wants to do something about. But I think one of the things 2 or 3 years ago I came to was it's all being impeded by this fact that we don't have a level playing field when it comes to speech, political speech anymore. And that's going to get in the way of everything you're going to try to change. Whether it's any of those, immigration or gun control, whatever it is. So that's why this is a fundamental issue that cuts across everything. And somehow, so when we are talking to groups, that point needs to be made, because some people will say, well, that's too difficult. It's too difficult to amend the Constitution. It's too difficult to get the SEC to change the rule on transparency or whatever. And somehow I think this is going to, how do we get there? I think that's going to be a very important part. That's what I'm here.
Well, and I think that we make our job is to make the connections to show, but it isn't necessarily to say, well, stop doing that and start doing this, because people it's hard enough to be a volunteer working for social change in this country, in this environment, right? So you're going to do something that fulfills you, that sparks you, and that's what people are going to do, and they should. But it's about making the connections and building solidarity between these issues to show the connections, and to be willing to, like Joy said, it's like about energy, but I do think that there's also room in there for solidarity. And so if there is a climate justice or a climate change thing happening, I think that Move to Amend there's connections there, of course, but it doesn't mean that we all do everything all the time, and that there'd be room for that. Yeah?
There definitely is I agree with everything you just said. I was one of the people that was at the Occupy, and that's what brought me to here today, is because that, as you were stating, it's quite clear that the system is rigged. I mean,
right.
it's very evident. I mean, with everything that happened with, the bailouts and, the SEC, and I mean, the rampant corruption of the whole thing. And so there's plenty of common ground. I totally agree. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's just going to spread because people, it's only people, I think, that really have their head in the sand or are afraid, as you were saying, Dave, that are afraid to admit that it's as bad as it is. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But people know that they're making the connections.
Mm-hmm. There's one thing I'm going to say, though, to just be real explicit about it, because I think that it serves us to do so. So this anti-oppression framework that we are committed to, and that Move to Amend from the very beginning said that in order to get this done, we need to build a multiracial movement, and it needs to be a democracy movement. And so we have taken that on explicitly, one, because obviously that is the right thing to do, but two, if you look historically at these movements that we talk about that have brought us to where we are now. I mean, you can look at the history of this country going from 5% of the population to where we have now having personhood, and the history of the movements have been about people driving themselves into the Constitution that was originally written not for them, right? Not for most of us. So, and we're not all in it yet, but we've made some progress. And every single one of those movements actually was multiracial, it was multi-generational, and it built across class as well. Not maybe the 1% and the 0%, but within the strata recognized that class is another way that's used for divide and conquer, and that was explicit. So we have to replicate that. We have to do the same thing. And let's take a look around this room and look at what our makeup is, right? We do not have a multiracial room that represents the population of Charlotte or of North Carolina or of the rest of the region that we're in. And that is true whenever we go to a Move to Amend convergence, no matter what part of the country we're in. And we have to be real about that reality. And so I think that it is relevant in terms of talking about who we are targeting to work with and go shoulder to shoulder with. And if we're saying the Tea Party, let's start with the Tea Party because they are out there. Like, yes, there may be people out in the streets so that we've got that common ground. But in terms of the point of the values, I agree with David that you're right, that it's diverse and you can't put everybody in a box. But in terms of the vocal representation of who is talking for the Tea Party, there's some pretty bad stuff there, right? So certainly not anti-oppressive language, and not multiracial. So that we do need to be intentional about who we're most trying to build alliances with, who we're putting our energy and resources into developing common ground with. And we've got to be explicit that at this point, the people who are drawn to working on this amendment campaign are mostly white, mostly older, mostly from middle class or upper middle class background. And it depends in terms of, there's some gender diversity for sure, but oftentimes in terms of like who gravitates first, it's also men. So we have some work to do. And I want to put it out there so that we can tackle it instead of kind of dancing around it. So I'm doing that.
If I could, when we say that we've got some work to do, we do mean that the big national movement, but I also want to really lift this up. You know, both Caitlin and George have mentioned the national leadership team. There are 12 of us on the national leadership team. We are across the country from Florida to the Pacific Northwest, the Northeast, the South, here in North Carolina. George lives in North Carolina. We've got Jerome Scott, who's in Atlanta. But the thing I really want to point out to you is of those 12 people, you're looking at the only white man. Now, I don't say that to get, yeah, right? Like your eyes, yeah, I can't help but to see. Your eyes just got big, right? Of a 12-person national leadership team, there's only one white guy. And not because there's not a place for white guys, but because those of us on the national leadership team have invested the time and energy in creating an anti-oppression framework of how we operate, and we have attracted a multiracial leadership who come out. I mean, and we're talking about Rich Monet, who is the international vice president of Workers United in the Midwest, who's got 100,000 workers that he actually represents in negotiations. Right? I mean, Jerome Scott is kind of like a big deal for those who know his history and background from Project South and then the U.S. Social Forum process. I mean, these are movement leaders who have said, and I'll never forget when George said, you know what? Y'all are serious. And it's like, yeah, like we are. And what we're trying to do, like, we're not asking you and your local affiliates to do anything that we have not done and that we're not continuing to do. So we're in it with you is what we're getting at. And I do think that it's complex. So I can agree with Tom and Dan and what they said at the same moment that I can agree with Caitlin and what she said. I don't think that these are mutually exclusive or even inherently contradictory. I spend most of my time, though, trying to get with the Bill of Rights Defense Committee and the Hip Hop Congress and the U.S. Social Forum. But when I'm invited to a Tea Party group, I'll go and talk to them. It's a question of where I'm really spending my time and energy. Because sadly, I got to admit, Tom, some of those Tea Party people I'm related to. Right? So sometimes I get organizing opportunities, you know, at family get-togethers.
Yeah, you never know.
Aren't we all?
I was about to say. Yeah.
Process question. If we take away all constitutional rights from corporations, where does it leave corporate things? And where does it leave corporate immortality? Third, what to do to the press?
You want me to do this one, Caitlin, because it's kind of a lawyerly wonder. All right, so there are three questions there. If you didn't understand, where does it leave the corporate veil? The idea of the corporation having limited liability, that's called the corporate veil. The ability to accumulate capital and do certain things. I'm going to be clear. Limited liability is not corporate constitutional rights. So our amendment, as proposed, the We the People amendment that's actually in Congress right now and that is growing, would not affect that one way or the other. It would, however, shift the balance of power so that we could begin to have an honest conversation about how should capital be accumulated and who should get to do it and what should it be done with. But on its face, the We the People amendment does not affect the veil whatsoever. Likewise, it would not affect corporate immortality. I mean, it would, however, make it clear that it's a political decision about how corporations should be created, what we should allow corporations to be done. And I think that that's really important, is that we are principled about this. I have some ideas about capitalism, right? I have some very specific ideas about what I think ought to be done, but I don't think that should be imposed. I think that should actually be part of the democratic process about how economic democracy ought to actually operate. The last question, I'm sorry, I've lost. The press. So it's really important to recognize that this notion of, but the press are incorporated and therefore you're going to be damaging the First Amendment is fundamentally false. And that is because there is not a single of the constitutional cases that deal with freedom of the press or the First Amendment that have ever, and I mean ever, been held, well, because the New York Times is incorporated, therefore they have some constitutional rights. No, the First Amendment stands alone. Congress shall not pass any law, blah, blah, blah. It is very explicit. Our amendment would not affect in the least any of the First Amendment cases. And honestly, any lawyer who tries to make that argument, she or he is either confused and hasn't thought about it, or she or he is trying to obfuscate and confuse you. So that's how I would answer that question on the First Amendment.
Are there any other questions or comments, things we didn't say that you thought you should have heard that you want to add to the discussion?
And remember, we got all day tomorrow, but this is just this is our framing evening together.
Well, the thing that struck me the most is when you said, we are here to win. That's what I'm here for.
Right on.
You're in the right spot. We're anti-American. They're going to say we're going to destroy the economy. Like, if they can say that with a straight face anymore, I don't know. I mean, like, I could tell you what their arguments are going to be.
Here's what's being said right now. There's a lot of concern about nonprofit corporations. Oh, nonprofit corporations will not be able to operate, and so we should make a loophole for nonprofits and allow them to have constitutional rights. And that is being said not even by the corporations, but by large nonprofits. We actually have a longer piece on the website in the recommended reading section about why nonprofit corporations do not have, should not have, and do not need constitutional rights. One, Citizens United, nonprofit corporation. Political Action Committee, nonprofit corporation. So we can't make a loophole for them and expect the amendment to actually do anything. And I think that it's a bigger issue around the way social change happens in this country with the nonprofit industrial complex, basically, and organizations that kind of lose sight of why maybe they came together in the first place and then become about perpetuating themselves and working, kind of throwing in with their for-profit corporate kin. So, we're very clear on our position on that, but I'm sad to say that actually Bernie Sanders and Ted Deutsch in Congress introduced an amendment, not this term, they took it back because they got a lot of backlash, but last cycle there was an amendment introduced as part of this whole thing that was the We the People Amendment, except that nonprofit corporations were exempted and unions. So I think I think you raised a very good point. Is it Kate or Katie? It's Kate. About being vigilant and concerned and not allowing these kind of confusing things that come up to keep us from keeping clear. And our job is to help explain to people why and then there's red herrings that come up like, well, Planned Parenthood's clients will be can't be kept private and women who get abortions because of the constitutional rights of Planned Parenthood. But no, individuals have a right to privacy that is not, that does not rely on Planned Parenthood's constitutional rights as a corporation. We have those rights ourselves. So there are arguments we can make back, and I think we should not get too tied down in the legal minutia, but there are folks who are going to want to drag us there, and that is a good way to confuse. So these things are important that we understand at least enough and know where to direct people to where we can get more information.
Oh, yeah.
uses that tactic because when you put it in front of the public, they gravitate to it right away. They're all about it. And so finding those opportunities for the public to get to express their will so that we can show to our state and federal representatives, look, this is what your constituency wants, but if you're not going to get with us, then we will find somebody else who will, because ultimately this is going to need to be a litmus test for elections, right? Which do you support the amendment? Will you ratify it if you're in the state legislature? Will you become a co-sponsor if you're in Congress or the Senate? And that has to be something that folks know, okay, I've got to pick a side.
If I had $1 for every person I've said move to amend who answered me by saying, what is that? I could found a corporation.
Well, you know what? I'd like to do it this way.
I guess one thing I'm asking, is there any way that some of this energy and information can get to the public that does nothing but sit on this squat and watch television?
Well, I mean, that's a deeper conversation. Move to Amend did not even exist before 2010. Whenever we were together, what were we, about 15 people in that room? So we went from 15 people looking at each other and thinking, well, what do we think?
What do you think? What do you think?
What do you think? You know, should we give this a shot? Today, we're at 308,000 and we're still growing. We've got 160 local affiliates and growing. We've helped over 500 communities pass resolutions in support of our efforts, and that number is going up. We've put it on the ballot 28 times in 28 voting districts, including, as Caitlin said, in Scott Walter's district, and I'm sorry that the sister left, but just sort of, she mentioned Montana, right? The state of Montana voted on the Move to Amend, and we won. We put it on the ballot 28 times, including in very conservative areas. Anybody want to guess how many times we've won? 28. We haven't lost nary a one. I mean, by every objective standard, sister, we're getting larger, stronger, and better organized. So the fact that people haven't heard of Move to Amend yet, that's all right. You know, we're growing. And I guess I wanted to just sort of conclude with this. You know, we are trying a congressional approach. I'm willing to actually have a constitutional convention if that's what it takes. But that's a Y in the road, whether it's 2/3 of Congress proposes or 2/3 of the states call for a convention. But I want to just focus on that Congress for a moment, because let me tell you something, folks. It's still going to take 3/4 of the state legislatures to ratify any amendment. So I want to be very clear. It's going to take a broad, deep, educated, militant movement, as George says, that makes it an inevitability. And I'm going to tell you this. Those members of the state legislature who are going to vote to amend the Constitution and ratify the We the People Amendment, they're probably not in the state legislature right now.
Not ours.
They're not in North Carolina.
But those people who are going to be in the legislature, they are already bored.
Yeah.
You feel me? Like, I'm talking about, we are, like, if you had been an abolitionist in the 1840s, they would have thought you were crazy what you were trying to do. If you believe that women should have the ability to vote in elections before Seneca Falls, you were nuts. I mean, by every reasonable standard, people who actually are calling for systemic transformational change when you're in the early stages of it, it's crazy talk. Because there's a simple 4-step process. Some of you know it. Gandhi described it. You want systemic change? 4 steps. First, you work for systemic social change, and they, the ruling elite, will ignore you.
Ignore you.
You keep doing your work for systemic social change, and they, the ruling elite, will laugh at you. You keep doing your work for social change so you can move to step 3, and that is where they will fight you like hell. And you keep doing your work for social change so you can move to step 4. You win. That's been the history of every single one. And with all due respect and with some humility, may I suggest, Gandhi forgot that there are actually 5 steps. You know what the 5th step is? Everybody who told you you were crazy for what you were trying to do will now say that was inevitable.
Yeah.
Right?
That's right.
It's
That's
like,
right.
of course.
It was
like,
gonna happen
it was gonna
anyway.
happen,
It was just a matter of time.
I mean, what I'm
Yeah.
telling you is this. We ought to actually, like, I don't know about you, but sometimes whenever I really start thinking about the work that I do day in and day out, my pants fit a little different. You know? My jacket just falls on my shoulders a little bit different because it's like, damn it, man, I'm doing the work that I am supposed to be doing to make this country the country of liberty, justice, and equality that I was promised as a little boy. And whenever we start to think of ourselves that way and we put ourselves in that historic context, that's when I say, you know what, it is inevitable. But you know what? It's going to be inevitable because people like you do the work that we're doing this weekend.
Awesome.
All right.
All right, so tomorrow, any logistics we need to cover with people for tomorrow?
Tomorrow we will start off in the room across the hall. So same place, but just across the hall because there will be martial arts going on in here. And then in the afternoon we'll come back in here. And I don't think we'll start at 9. And I think, is there any questions about tomorrow? Folks have?
Yes, ma'am.
Are people supposed to eat in this vicinity at lunchtime? What's the deal?
Yeah, lunch is on your own. There's in the program, there are a couple of options that are nearby to help you. And if there are locals who want to suggest other options, then please feel free.
As long as you can
and
come
we'll
back on time after lunch, that's what's important.
Hour. I know that we're in sort of a, strip mall-y area, but there are places to eat nearby.
There are. All right, then. We'll see y'all in the morning.
9 a.m. tomorrow morning.
Have a good night. Thanks.